I don't hear the drum roll.
Good morning, folks. If you're just joining us, thank you for joining us. We're going to wait maybe 3 more minutes so others can join us as well, and then we'll begin today's morning school. Again, good morning, folks. If you're just joining us this morning, thank you for joining us. We'll wait maybe 2 more minutes and then we'll start today's morning school.
You know, at least you could have provided us with a McMuffin or something.
Yes.
Maybe a gift card. Should I look in the mail for one?
You should.
It'll be in kind for me and the senator, but everybody else can have them.
You have to, anything that you get, you have to, well, it's below 50, right? $50.
I think they just went up to 100, didn't it?
I think
I
so.
don't agree with that, but yeah. If you gave me a McMuffin, I would definitely put it on my report.
It better be a big McMuffin.
It's $100 worth of a big muffin. How about that?
Well, with inflation, that may not be but a couple years away.
Again, good morning, folks. Thank you for joining us this morning. We're going to wait maybe just 1 more minute and then we'll start.
Oh, 169. Hey, since gambling is legal now, maybe we should have done an over and under on how many's going to get in.
Technically, I think you start, what, August 9th, right? Or sometime in August is when you're going to, yeah.
Yes, it's 90 days after, so.
Yeah. All right, I think we are going to start. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Luigi Del Puerto. I'm the publisher and editor of the Arizona Capital Times, and welcome to today's morning scoop. Broadly speaking, we will talk about the major new election laws, how they affect the duties of election officials at the county and state levels, and city levels as well, and how they affect voters. Of course, this is an opportunity to go through some of these major changes and flesh them out. But first, I want to thank the Arizona Citizens Clean Elections Commission for sponsoring this series. The Citizens Clean Elections Commission administers the Citizens Clean Elections Act, which voters passed in 1998. The act seeks to restore citizen participation and confidence in the political system, improve the integrity of the Arizona state government, and promote freedom of speech under the U.S. and Arizona constitutions. Last year, and just like every election cycle, the commission organized a series of debates so voters have the opportunity to hear directly from the candidates, ask questions on the issues and that matter most to them, and of course, vote informed. This is in addition to the commission's voter outreach. And here to welcome us this morning is Gina Roberts, the Voter Education Director for the Citizens Clean Elections Commission. Gina, of course, administers a robust public education program that strives to encourage participation in the political process from voters across the state. Gina?
Hi, Luigi. Thank you so much. And good morning to everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us today for this discussion. I'd like to thank the Arizona Capital Times, of course, for their morning scoop segments, and of course to all of our panelists. Thank you. We look forward to hearing each of your individual and unique perspectives on election laws and legislation. To our audience, again, thank you for taking the time to join us. One of the reasons why the Commission chose to sponsor this event is because we believe in promoting participation in the political process. And, that means a lot of different things. So one, of course, it includes voting and voting informed. And that's where the Commission comes in, most particularly with our website to help you with everything that you need. So our website has a wealth of information on how you can get your ballot, the logistics, everything you need to know from who's running on the ballot, what the issues are, but again, how to get your ballot, how to cast it, and so you can do that informed and confidently. So I encourage everybody to visit our website, azcleanelections.gov, and there you can also find links to our social handles, and I also encourage you to follow us on social media. This way, you never miss an election. I know we're just coming off of a big election year, but of course, there's actually elections still occurring right now. There's an election next week, and so these local elections matter, and they're just as important. So if you follow us, then you'll never miss out. You'll always be informed about what the upcoming election dates are. And aside from just voting, we also want voters to understand the policy behind these election laws and decisions. And so that's why we brought this panel to you. So you know what's changed so as we gear up for the 2022 elections, but also you can understand the policy implications behind them. Again, thank you for joining us. And with that, I will turn it back over to Luigi.
Gina, thank you so much for being gracious with your time this morning. We have a great discussion this morning, and we have a great panel as well. Joining us is Amy Chan, who chairs the Arizona Citizens Clean Elections Commission. Amy was admitted to the state bar in 1999. Initially, she worked as an immigration attorney, helping people obtain immigration benefits through the administrative and immigration court process. In 2001, she began work as a legislative research analyst for the House Judiciary Committee. She was an administrative law judge for the Corporation Commission from 2005 to 2006, and then returned to the legislature as a policy advisor and counsel to the majority for the state Senate. In 2009, Secretary of State Ken Bennett appointed her as state election director, and she served in that capacity until 2013, when she left to spend more time with her growing family. And then Senate Democratic leader Katie Hobbs appointed Amy to the Citizens Clean Elections Commission for a 5-year term expiring in January of 2022. Amy, thank you again for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me. I'm so happy to be here with you all.
Also joining us is Will Gaona, who is the Legislative Affairs Director for Arizona Secretary of State Katie Hobbs. Prior to joining the Secretary of State's office, Will worked as the Policy Director at the ACLU of Arizona and as a staff attorney at the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. Will, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
Also joining us is Recorder David Stevens, who was first elected as Cochise County Recorder in 2016. Prior to becoming Recorder, David served 8 years in the Arizona House of Representatives. He resides in Sierra Vista. He grew up in a small town in Illinois, and after seeing a computer during a school field trip, he decided he wanted to work in the computer field. He joined the U.S. Army at the age of 17, where he served and received career training in computers. He served 10 years in the U.S. Army, which included serving with the Illinois National Guard and the Arizona National Guard. Recorder Stevens, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me back.
And finally joining us this morning is Senator Martin Quezada, who serves as the Minority Co-Whip in the Arizona Senate. After receiving his bachelor's degree in Administration of Justice and Ethnic Studies from ASU West, Senator Quezada spent 5 years working as a research analyst and policy advisor to the Democratic caucus in the Arizona Senate and the Arizona State House of Representatives. Then he joined law school at ASU. In 2009, Senator Quezada opened the doors to the law office of Martin J. Quezada, where he practices in the areas of criminal defense, domestic relations, civil litigation, and election law. Senator Quezada, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me, Luigi.
Unfortunately, Senator Kelly Townsend is unable to join us this morning. She has an emergency that she has to attend to. But I'm glad that the others are able to join us this morning. And I want to thank you again for being so generous with your time. Broadly speaking, as I mentioned, we will discuss major election laws and new election laws. And I think I'm going to start with just which from your point of view, which new laws would you consider to be good elections practices? And I guess I'll start with David.
You want me, which one are good?
From the laws that have been passed, which would you consider to be good, solid election law practices?
Well, it's interesting. We had well over 100 bills introduced this year, but few made across the board. I'd start off with probably the prohibition of private money into the elections area, the Facebook dollars. I think it's a bad precedent to set to let individuals or corporations fund government practices. It's typically, or it should be, done by the government itself. And when you let private people start funding government operations, things tend to go what they want. As you know, strings are always attached. It was a good thing they put that through, put an end to that. I don't know if anybody's got any other comments to that, but it was one of the first things that I'm aware of in my 4.5 years here that came up that private dollars were coming in. But I've never been a supporter of privately funding government operations, and I don't think I ever will.
And your fear, if I may paraphrase that, is that if government entities started receiving private funding, that they will consider that private funding or the potential of losing it, for example, when they make decisions. That's your worry.
Well, and then the strings attached to it. It's, at first the money is always free and there's not a lot there, but consider, would you be okay with the NRA and Jack Daniels running the ATF? Are you okay with McDonald's running the school lunch program? Because at some point they will interject their policy into that and it'll be tied to the dollars. We see that with the feds and the money coming down. We got CARE Act money, but it was very specific on what you can spend it on. So that is my big concern, is that when private people start funding it, they're going to interject what they want to see out of it.
Senator Quezada, I want to take your, I'm going to get your take on that one, but also I wanted to see from your point of view, which new election laws you would consider to be good practices.
Yeah, I guess first, in regard to the private money, I would partially agree with Recorder Stevens. I think that, the government should be funding all of those elections practices, but unfortunately, we weren't. We weren't providing that funding to our local governments to conduct those elections, and so it kind of left them no choice but to seek the funding that was necessary in order to run effective elections. And so what we did here is we handicapped ourselves or our local counties when they want to run these elections, if we don't provide that funding for them. And I think that's problematic, because if there's no other option for them to get that money, then we're going to run into some problems. We're going to run into some bad situations when we conduct those elections. So I think that we put the cart before the horse with that bill. As far as other good bills that have been passed this year, as far as elections goes, there weren't a whole. This wasn't a session of a lot of good actions in the legislature. And I'm getting a fire drill here.
Fire alert.
Please cease operations and leave the building utilizing the nearest exit or
Alrighty.
fire exit stairway. Do not use elevators. Repeat, do not use elevators.
So I'm being told to leave the building here.
Yeah, maybe you can rejoin us by
I will.
yourself from outside.
You can run over to the executive tower and join me over here, Senator, if you like.
I didn't pull that fire alarm, but just
All right.
I think a Republican did.
The building utilizing the nearest exit.
Okay,
or
excuse me,
They're
guys.
trolling you, Senator Quezada, is what's happening. They're trolling you. All right, so Senator Quezada will leave, but he'll rejoin us.
Well, let me jump in there, Luigi, because
Right.
there's an issue that the elections are run by the counties. They're not funded by the state outside the PPE. So it's a county function. I didn't have any problems getting any money for my election in Cochise County. I can't imagine any county would would underfund an election. And I don't know what he meant by not properly funding it. So I don't know what Maricopa needed money-wise to run their election. It was not a complaint I'd heard before. And the one comment came up in another issue I was on, that the state funds elections. They don't. They come in with the county. And it's amazing how much the county has to spend. I know Cochise County spends roughly $180 million a year to operate. That's a lot of money for 130,000 people. I could guess what Maricopa spends. I don't know, but if you extrapolate that out, it's a lot of money. So I don't know what he means by they don't properly fund it. I don't know what it is he wanted that he didn't get. It's too bad he had to leave. Hopefully someone didn't just pull the firearm. Was he in the state Senate? Is that where he was at?
Yeah, he was in the state Senate.
Okay.
We're assuming everything's fine. It's just a fire drill, and he'll be back on before we know it. Will, I want to get your take on which you would consider to be good practices from your point of view, but also if you want to weigh in on private funding for election administration and election activities.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, I'll on the private funding issue, I'll echo a little bit of what the senator said, is that if the state wants to ban the secretary's office or county elections departments from accepting these grants, these philanthropic grants, then I think that the state may have a role to play in ensuring that these things are properly funded. In the most recently passed budget, if you'll recall, the state put aside $12 million general fund dollars to help fund things like audits. And if the state has $12 million to pay for audits, I'd like to think they have money to help, the state's chief election official or county elections departments do things like voter education and voter outreach. If there's money to be spent on these things, there should be some consideration to how we're, reaching out to voters and making sure that they have access. And so, while Recorder Stevens is right that the main place where the state funds elections currently is the PPE, there's also some various reimbursements and things that happen, but the state has put aside money in this budget for audits, and that fund is administered by the state treasurer, who has no role in elections. And so I think if there's money available, we should be using it for other things to ensure that elections departments don't need to look for these private grants. As far as good policy that was passed this session, there wasn't a ton of it. There was a bill, I want to say it was Representative Kaiser's bill, but it basically says that the Secretary of State's office has to take an annual report from the Department of Health Services and run it against the voter registration database to ensure that deceased voters are removed from the voter rolls. Now, our office is already required to do that on a monthly basis with monthly reports, and was already doing that with annual reports. So it's basically just codifying the existing policy. I think we can all agree that we don't, when people do pass away, those people should be removed from the voter rolls, and the state was already doing a good job of, some common sense measures to do that, and we just codified it this session. So if I had to point to one piece of good policy, I think that's it, but it has no effect on the actual practices because we're already doing that.
And finally, Amy.
Thank you. The first thing that came to mind that was codifying the existing practice that Will just mentioned was the death records. Codifying that is a good thing. I mean, I think it was already required in the procedures manual, perhaps, whether it was just practice or in the procedures manual, I can't recall. But that's obviously a very good practice to be updating the death records on a regular basis. And, one thing that I hope everyone understands is what a wonderful example Arizona sets nationally for our procedures and practices. Our laws have given, the authority to our Secretary of State to do this statewide procedures manual to make sure that every county does everything exactly the same. So voters are not being treated differently in different counties. So that was definitely a positive, whether it was fully necessary, I think it can't hurt codifying it. And what David said about the private funding, I mean, I'll be honest, just the principle of having private money in elections, I don't care for as a policy matter. I think this legislation was a reaction to a year that was a complete aberration with our pandemic. I think I'm not sure if elections need additional funding. I think that would happen at the local level for recorders and election offices, and at the cities, of course. Now, the Secretary of State has a different situation because the legislature is the one that funds that office. But I think the offices did what they needed to educate their voters a little more fully with the pandemic. There was a lot of confusion and potential confusion for voters. Arizona was in a good place because we have our early voting system that so many use already, especially our permanent early voting system, which actually was a change that was made this year to active early voting list. But I think that was the reason we saw some of the offices reach for some of the private money that was available, was to educate voters on some of the changes we were seeing this past year with the pandemic. And my understanding is that, at the county level anyway, because of the way their budgets are, they had to get approval, and there was transparency with what was happening through their boards of supervisors. And I know that I saw things as a voter, just as a private voter, that the Secretary's office was also participating in this. And again, as a principal, I think this law is probably a good thing, but I think there were specific reasons that was used over the past year.
Senator Quezada is able to join us again. Thank you, Senator. Is everything okay in the building?
The fire alarm went off. They said it's real, so I moved over to the house.
Okay. All right. I hope everything's okay there in your chamber. I want to pause here for a second and just ask our viewers and our listeners, if you want to send in your questions, please do so. You can send in your questions via the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many of them toward the end of the program. We were talking about matching the death records against the voter list, and I know, David, this is something that you've been doing or trying to do on your own. If you can tell us, to what extent you've been able to essentially purge your voter list of people who have died.
Sure. Let me go back. 6 years ago, I ran legislation to do the annual list, because the process was they would get a monthly list from vital records, and the SOS would do the purge from that point. But the next month, they never looked back to the previous months they ever purged. And my perspective on it was identity theft. Was annually, you need to look at everybody to make sure somebody's identity wasn't stolen. So that's where that came from 6-7 years ago. Now, we are still using the newspaper to check obituaries. And I made a joke about this earlier. I actually do it in my office. Staff doesn't do the death records I do, because I check to make sure I'm not in there first. And if I'm not, it's going to be a good day. But the fact that there's no requirement to put one in the paper, so we don't always get those. There's automatic reductions. The Secretary of State, which in my opinion should not be doing it. Voter registration is the county recorder's sole responsibility, and we're the only ones that should be altering records in there. I don't like ADOT doing it with voter registration, the online, because they're in charge of the software. I think that needs to be our responsibility. And that was one bill that went through, the governor veto, but we'll move on. So there's issues with, are we getting everybody? And I brought up in an earlier meeting that I have family members who have lived here most of their lives. We're talking 4 and 5 decades, that have passed away in Maricopa County. And they're not on that annual list. So I don't know what happened between them passing away and the vital records being set up. So somewhere there's a problem with us getting the proper data to make sure we remove them if they do pass away.
Right. So I want to go to a couple of the other major election law changes that have been passed. One of them changes, I think, as Amy noted, the permanent early voting list to the active early voting list. Primarily, this new law stops early ballots from coming to voters if voters do not use them. If voters do not vote consecutively in 2 previous election cycles. I want to ask, Martin, first of all, what he thinks of this new law, but also want to ask I want to ask Will, and Dave and Amy, what does this mean for election officials? And how does this change the elections manual, for example? And I guess what should voters keep in mind as the state implements this new law? But I'll start with Senator Quezada.
Yeah, thank you, Luigi. I think this bill was unnecessary, but it's a version that we've seen move through this process over the last several cycles. And every cycle or every session that we've been here at the legislature, we've seen this bill and we've testified against it. And the community has come out opposed to it because of the negative impact that it would have on the voters who are on that list, who may then be purged from that list, and the impact it would have on their ability to cast their votes. Those concerns have not changed, and there have been no efforts to rectify the concerns that have been brought up. We've seen the exact same language move through this process for the last several cycles. So I'm really troubled by this bill. I think that it's going to have an impact, especially on our newer voters, our younger voters, voters who aren't yet in the practice of voting consistently. And those are the ones that are going to be impacted the most when they want to cast a vote and realize that they're not on that list.
Will, how does this change your practice? How do you go through actually implementing this?
One thing I just want to note for the folks that are listening is this is one of several bills that is the effort. There's an effort to refer it to the ballot. So it's entirely possible this may not go into effect at least for some time, but maybe not at all. And so I just want to let folks know that that effort is out there, and so this might all be speculative. Because of that, I think that it's hard to say what we'll see in the procedures manual about that. This is a procedures manual year, so there will be a new procedures manual. The deadline for signatures for that referenda, precedes the date for the procedure manual. So I think we'll be able to see, whether or not it's going to be on the ballot. And if it's not, then you probably won't see anything in the procedures manual, and you won't see, really any changes ahead of this heading to the ballot.
So I want to get this one right. So, it's under a referendum, and if they have enough signatures, this law is put on hold until the next general election. What you're saying is that if it gets on the ballot, if it's on the general election, ballot next year, then you probably will not make any changes to the election procedures manual, and then do it, whatever the people decide, whether to approve it or to reject it. Then at that point, that's when you make changes.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this would be on the ballot theoretically in November 22, and then 23 is a new procedures manual here. So if it does go to the ballot, and then the people decide to keep the law in place, then you'd see in the procedures manual. But if it's on the ballot, it's not an effective law. And so we won't be addressing that in the procedures manual, because the procedures manual is really designed to kind of fill in the gaps in terms of implementing the laws on the books. So
David, I want to go to you. And what does this, what does this mean for the voters? What should voters keep in mind, as we prepare for its implementation? Because there's always the chance that they won't get enough signatures, the people who are pushing for a referendum, or the people will just agree with this particular law. But what does this mean for voters?
Well, it's, and I believe that, say it goes into law now, it won't take effect, I think, till 24, because you have to look backwards for elections. It puts an extra burden on us to identify the people, send them a letter. They have 90 days to respond, which is not consistent with other type of letters we send out. Like if you're going to go from active to inactive, it's a 35-day window. And that's from the Motor Voter Bill of 93. We call it NAVRA. But it's not going to really do anything, because if we take you off the active list, you can re-register right away and come back on it. There's no teeth in the bill to do anything to keep you off. Now, the process we have is you're coming up 90 days before a federal primary. All recorders send out a notice to everybody on the active list. Hey, you're on this list. Do you still want to be on it? You want to update your address? And if you're a non-party person, which ballot do you want? So we do that every 2 years, 90 days out before the primary election. We get that information back in, either comes back in undeliverable or information is changed. If we don't get it back in, nothing happens. That we make the assumption that you are who you are, you want your ballot, and you're going forward. And that is right before the election. This bill is will take effect right after an election, which means you have 18 months before the next federal primary election, roughly, to have any effect at all. So I don't see it really amounting to anything. There's no way, had they put something in there and say, okay, if we take you off, you can't be on their active list for 2 elections. That would have been some type of restriction, but there are none. So if we take you off, you can go right back online or in our office and re-register for it. So I don't see this, other than having more work for us, having an effect going forward at all.
So that what you're saying is that the challenge on your end is really figuring out who are the people who haven't voted consecutively in the last 2 election cycles, sending them a letter and letting them know, if you got to be if you haven't voted, then you will be taken off the list. And at that point, the voters can then just decide, all right, I'm just gonna, you take me off, that's fine, I'll just re-register. So there is an extra step for the voters, but what you're saying, it's not immensely difficult.
Yeah, and there could be confusion that they think we're taking them off the voter registration list, which we're not. It's just the active early voting list. So there's a lot of confusion in elections now. Most of the calls I get are, why did you send me a ballot? Or why didn't you send me a ballot? Well, you either signed up or you didn't, kind of thing before. So sending this extra letter out will cause some confusion to people, that why am I getting this letter? I'll just re-register or re-sign up for it and then be done with it. And then we got to do this every 2 years. We sent the numbers into the SOS. I believe they asked for these numbers while this is going through. It's not a huge number of people compared to the people that actually get the ballot and vote with it. So it's a minimal intervention on this, but it's an extra set of procedures we have to follow. I don't mind the extra work. I just don't think it's going to bear any fruit.
Amy, I want to go to you. How does this affect the Clinton Elections Commission's voter outreach? I know you have a very robust voter outreach program. What does it do to your program?
I mean, I think it definitely is something we need to incorporate so that voters are aware that if they are not voting their, I still want to call it PVOL, the permanent early voting list, but if they're not choosing to vote their early ballot, that they may get a notice then after 2 years that they will be removed if they don't respond. So it does add that extra step for voters. I think, I love the permanent early voting list. I've been on it, I think, since it started. And it may be a problem that was looking for a solution or a solution looking for a problem. But I'm not sure which, but I think we're definitely going to have to include it in our voter outreach for sure. And, there's so much for voters to have to know. For folks who work in elections, it all makes sense. We understand it, but voters have their own lives. They're working, they're supporting their families. And so that's the challenge, is adding this in and helping people understand the impact, because a lot of voters may be on the PVOL and for whatever reason, they still go in to vote in person perhaps, and that'll count against them. So I believe under this bill.
Right, and Will also, I wanna flesh that out a little bit. So if you're not actually sending in your early ballot, if you're going to, you're on the PVOL list, you get your ballot, but you choose to go to a voting center on election day or a precinct on election day, then this counts against you. Right? For the purposes of this law, you haven't satisfied the requirement of having voted consecutively in the last 2 election cycles. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. And I'll admit the bill was poorly drafted and a lot of people were confused about it. I think that, I think voters were kind of confused about what it meant. I think even some of the legislators that were involved in the bill were confused about what it meant and had different interpretations of it. But I think you have it exactly right, Luigi. So you could be, for the purposes of Arizona law, you could be an active voter and vote in every single election. You could vote in primaries and generals, in your local elections, and bond elect. You could vote in every election in person and be removed from the permanent early voting list if you don't, in one of those elections over the course of 2 years, vote with your ballot by mail. And I saw a question in the chat about that as well. It's the ballot, it's not the method. So if you go and drop that in a Dropbox, if you go and drop that off at a location on election day even, that's going to count as one of your 4. But if you go into that same location and vote in person, it's not going to count.
And sorry, Quezada, what about the argument that, if you're not voting actively, we're not using the early ballot actively, and then probably you shouldn't be on there.
Well, I think that my argument against that all along has always been the fact that someone is not casting a vote doesn't mean that they aren't considering their ballot and making a choice. And if we aren't giving them choices that they want to cast a vote on, that in and of itself is a choice. That is a vote itself. And so in a lot of ways, they are choosing to use that ballot the way that they want to. And we are now interfering with that choice that they're making.
And Luigi, if I could just add to that real quick.
Will and then David.
One of the things that Amy mentioned earlier is that we have this election system in Arizona that we should really be proud of. And one of the things about that in Arizona is we give voters so many choices, right? You can vote early by mail. You can go and vote with no excuse. You can go vote in person early, no excuse. Or you can choose to vote on election day. And you could make that choice, a different choice every single year, and that's okay. And so I think any legislation like this that really seeks to limit the choices of some voters is just unnecessary and not something we should be considering. Voters should have the choices available to them that they want to make on an annual basis, and we shouldn't be trying to limit those things.
David?
Yeah, and if you're not on the active list, we actually mail out a sample ballot to the households. So you have a chance to see the ballot and look at it, see what the names are on it. So everybody has a chance to see it. And a lot of people will mark up their sample ballot, bring it into election day, and use that as their voting guide to vote. So it's not like you can't see your ballot. That if you're not on the active list, you'll get a early ballot. You'll see the layout that the ballot's going to take.
I want to move on to another law, and this is a requirement of new ballots to be encoded with special anti-fraud protections, unique numbers and codes. I guess I'll start with Will. What does this mean for election officials? How does this change the way we, procure ballots, for example? And how much do you think it will cost us more if you've had some early analysis about potential costs to adding these new features in?
Sure. So I guess I want to start by clarifying that, when that was passed, and I think that went through actually in the budget, not as a standalone bill, though it was at one point a standalone bill. It's not a requirement. So counties don't have to implement these things. What the language does, it says, if you're going to introduce or include kind of anti-fraud measures on ballots, they have to meet certain standards. And these are the things that you can do. So it's an option, which has its pros and cons. I think that we're early on in this. And so our office has been really focused on having conversations with vendors, for example, both on, vendors who print ballots and to figure out, what's possible from their perspective, but also we need to figure out vendors that actually, produce the equipment that tabulates ballots. How might these measures actually affect the tabulation of ballots? And that's something we don't quite have the answer to yet. We've got, I think, maybe 3 different vendors that in Arizona. Most counties are on ES&S. Maricopa obviously uses Dominion. And I think there's maybe one other vendor. So it's going to take some time to figure out what's possible on the paper. How does this actually impact the tabulation of ballots? And what does that cost? So we're kind of working through that right now with vendors and with counties to kind of figure out a path forward on this stuff. But it's not something that you see, to my knowledge, in other states across the country. So this is kind of a new concept for the most part.
And Senator Quezada, would you recommend that the counties, in fact, comply with this? It's not a requirement, as Will said, but with this new law, and try to see if you can add, new security features on the ballot.
Well, and to follow up on what Will was saying, I mean, new security is great as long as you do the homework before and make sure that those are going to coincide with everything that you have to do when you're administering those elections. If you can make that work, great, go for it. But I think that going back to the bill and it's this provision in the budget, I was against it because this furthered a narrative that these provisions were necessary in the first place. And I don't believe that they were. And so what this was doing is it was only furthering a narrative that there is fraud taking place, that there are these high levels of security that are necessary because something bad is happening in our election system. And that's the narrative that has been pushed by this legislature this entire year.
All right. In fact, I do have a question for Amy. I just want to go back to the PEVIL or AVIL. Is it AVIL now?
Evil? No,
Evil?
I'm just kidding.
Yeah. The active voting, active voting early list.
Sure.
Amy, what would you tell the voters? As we try and navigate the complexities of this new requirement. The one thing I can think of course, is that if you're on the active list, and go on and vote and maybe send in your ballot or something like that. But I'm notorious for I'm on the PEVIL, but I do show up in person and vote in person, and that's just because I'm a journalist. I wanted to see what's going on in a voting center or in a voting precinct. But what would you recommend to not just the viewers and the listeners now, but just to voters in general?
Well, I think, Luigi, if you're voting your early ballot at a vote center, that's still going to be voting your early ballot. So you would not receive that notice. I mean, this really isn't going to impact anybody, I think, until 2025, if it does go into effect. I mean, Will mentioned the referendum had been pulled. So at that point, that's it's going to be pretty far out here where it's going to affect anyone. And I think the fact is, I mean, telling voters that it may add more confusion for voters, frankly, but the good news is they will still be getting that notice that David mentioned, informing them, you didn't vote your early ballot over the past, 2 years worth of elections. And therefore, do you still want to be on this active early voting list since you're not really active on it? Now, the question is whether voters will actually read that mail from the county and, respond. And if they don't, then they'll be removed. David, do I have that right? I think they would have to respond, take an active, affirmative step to respond to the county and say, oh, wait, yes, I do want to continue receiving my early ballot. And so I think, there's going to be just a lot to remind voters of that, just informing them of this and hopefully putting it in plain enough language they can understand. I mean, I use language that may be too wonky, but the staff, Gina and the other staff at Clean Elections, for example, are really good at kind of getting to the nub of the matter and helping folks understand what the implications are for themselves.
David, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, and one downside of this is it's going to happen right after the election, and most people won't be thinking about the election at the time. When we send the 90-day notice out, it's the height of the campaign season. You can't turn on a TV without seeing a campaign ad. So everybody knows the election's coming up. So you're better off doing it right before the election than right after. So I thought that was kind of a bizarre thing to do it right afterwards. I think you get less participation that way. But I still think this is more of a show bill than a work bill, but it got passed. So
On the suggestion, as proposed by this new law to using for the ballots being coded with special anti-fraud protections, what are you thinking in your county? Are you gonna do it?
yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Actually, this is one of the ballots that has it on there. You can see a couple of there it is, countermeasures there. You can't see the watermark. I don't know if you can see it or not.
No, it's not.
Probably not. I can give you a picture. Anyway, this was the ballot they.
Or
What?
is this a sample ballot with anti-security
Yes.
measures? Okay.
Yeah, Representative Fincham asked me for a ballot that Authentics could mock up. So I sent him our ballot from 2020, a spare one. they put the measures on here. He had a meeting at the Capitol, I believe in November, to go over these. And they talked about all of these measures. Now, the one thing in the bill that Will talked about, you could pick or choose which ones you want. There's 8 things that you could do, and you could do all 8 if you wanted, or just do one. And I equate that to the brakes on my car. So I stop at every stop sign and every stoplight, hopefully in time, but I don't always know my anti-lock brakes are working. But when I have to have my anti-lock brakes and they're there and they work, they save me from an accident. That's the reason these things are here. When we need them, they'll be there. And all these measures are put on the paper. There's confusion on that. Most of us buy our paper at one time in bulk. So it's sitting in a warehouse somewhere, and as counties need elections, they just pull off the top. So these countermeasures are in the paper, and then that blank paper you have to print the ballot on, and then you have to mail the ballot out to somebody. So you never know who's going to use that paper. We run, in 2020, in Cochise County, we actually ran 5 elections. And we're going to have one this November, so we'll have one this year. I'm sure Maricopa runs at least 4 a year. They're large enough with that. So I'm looking forward to implementing this. It probably won't happen in November. I don't think we're there yet. And I do believe this is going to be a referendum. Is that right, Will? These countermeasures? Is not a referendum? Okay.
No, I don't think this one is, no.
Okay.
Can you hold that up again, David, and show us the security marks there and what they are exactly?
Yeah, that's one of them. That's the barcode. Now that's printed on the paper before the ballot's printed. They know what areas will not have any marks on them. You've got these 2 here. That's got an RFID chip. And that's a Mylar symbol that interacts with the watermark. And the watermark is the state seal, and it covers all of the paper.
So Luigi, I just want to also go back to this security measure thing. So there's one thing I want to note, because the bill kind of made this, 1, optional, and 2, it has a list of things that counties can choose to do, and they can choose to do, like David mentioned, 1 of them, or they could do all 8 of them. I do think there's going to be a need for some voter education on this issue as well. Obviously, there's been a lot of disinformation out there about, bamboo in ballots and, watermarks on ballots previously and things like that. And if things aren't uniform in different counties, let's say Maricopa has certain things, and well, I live in Pinal, and I didn't see, my friend has this on his ballot and I don't have it on mine. Is my ballot real? Like, there's going to be a lot of calls into elections offices about some of this stuff that folks have never seen before, and questioning about, is my ballot real? Is it missing something? Should this be on here? Those kinds of things. And so it's going to create a huge voter education issue as well.
I agree. Yeah.
I want to look ahead to next year's legislative session, and I know there are some measures, proposals in your mind that you think would make our election system, our processes even more efficient. But I want to start with Senator Quezada. What are you proposing? What will you introduce next year? Of course, you're still in the minority, and so what are you thinking in terms of just making the elections more efficient, better for voters, and really improve participation by everybody?
Yeah, I think, what we've had a long discussion here today about a lot of unnecessary burdens and barriers that don't necessarily completely block people's access, but they make that access to the ballot a lot harder than it has to be. I want to go in the opposite direction. I think we should have a more accessible election system to the people. Governance by and for the people has been an American ideal, but I think unfortunately we've prevented that from becoming a reality, especially here in this state. And so I've introduced a series of bills over the last several years, and I will reintroduce them again. Things like automatic and same-day voter registration, voter re-enfranchisement for people who have had their voting rights taken away after felony convictions, and the Secretary of State's bill that she introduced this year that would streamline election administration, expand voting voting rights and enhance election security. She introduced a great bill that did all three of those things in a lot of different ways. I hope to work with the Secretary's office again next year and introduce a very similar bill again.
Thank you for that, Senator Quezada. And Amy, what are you thinking about in terms of course, voter outreach and how to improve that?
You know, we do it as a regular course of business. I think that our current program is, as you mentioned, extremely robust over the past, I don't know if it's been 10 years, but we've really grown that program quite a bit and hopefully made it better, you know, doing more campaigns via social media, as well as television ads around the election time, just to make sure that voters are aware of their options for true information rather than misinformation or malinformation. You know, communicating directly with their election officials. I know David mentioned he gets calls about things from voters when they're confused, which I think is the best thing for voters to do, is contact their recorder or their election office. Clean Elections is always here to help. And, you know, I think that going forward, that's the best thing we can do, you know, and I think what Senator Quesada was talking about, to my mind, and I think from the perspective of my fellow commissioners, you know, when you have more participation in the process, that's when you truly have representative government. And some of the not off the record, but not necessarily having to do with bills, but I saw some legislators comment about having the right type of voters. And those are my concerns going forward. You know, I think we just need to encourage more participation in general. And those are the kinds of policies that I like to see going forward.
I want to go to Will and then to David.
Yeah, I mean, like last session, you know, our office was certainly proud to work with Senator Quesada and Representative Solomon on the House side to introduce some legislation that accomplished just a number of things in an omnibus bill, including addressing issues of felony disenfranchisement and signature curing, but also things like post-election audits. The bill would have mandated that counties perform the post-election hand count audit, as well as created a pilot program to introduce risk limiting audits to Arizona, which is kind of a post-election audit method that is becoming more and more common across the country. It's kind of the cutting edge of post-election audits. And so, you know, there were some great election security measures in there. Unfortunately, those bills, you know, just didn't get a hearing, didn't get considered. But I imagine we'll bring some of that stuff back next session.
And finally, David.
Yeah, thank you. A couple things. You know, the governor vetoed a bill that would have brought the electronic voter registration out of ADOT back to the SOS and the recorders. I'd like to see that come back through. I'm a big proponent of I have a job to do. I should be doing it, nobody else. Go back through the death record process. There's something missing there. Now we are a member of the program called ERIC, which does state-to-state sharing, but not all 50 states are in it. And having served in the military, if you're somewhere else and you pass away, we may never get that information. So it's very difficult. And I'm looking at trying to streamline our UOCAVA process, which is more internal for us. The software we use has some issues that half my staff was tied up with nothing but overseas voters. We've got a robust system. Arizona's led the way. When HAVA came out in 2003, we had already started or completed most of the requirements of that. So we tend to be the tip of the spear for a military term on voting initiatives type things. So I'm looking forward to finding issues and correcting them. One thing is the write-in candidate. It didn't quite get fixed the way I thought it did or should have been. But those are the things.
What's going on with the write-in candidates? Can you explain that very briefly and what you want to achieve there?
Well, one bill made it through, but here's the problem we have. We have to send our ballot overseas at 45 days before the election. You could sign up to be a write-in candidate at 40 days. There's no vetting process. Maybe you don't qualify to be a write-in candidate. And then don't the people overseas have a right to know who's actually legitimately on the ballot running? So there was an issue with that. And my proposal was take it back to 76 days, because that's when elections are, I hate to use this term, but the supervisors will cancel election. If one person is running for a race like precinct committeemen, and they're the only one that filed. They just make them the winner and take them off the ballot. That saves space on the ballot. To go back to that day. But I got to go back over what got passed on the write-in legislation and find out what, if it got fixed or not. If it hasn't, get a legislator, probably Mr. Kavanaugh or Mr. Fincham. They seem to be very interested in running these type of bills and fix these issues that come up. I was able to get the recall initiative or the recall chapter of Title 19 rewritten, because I went to court a couple of years ago and there was mass confusion between all the lawyers and the judge about recalling a city mayor. There was so much change to the initiative process. They ignored recall and it caused massive problems when I was in court. So that finally got through, that got updated. So as things come up, I initiate those issues and generally they get through because like the ADOT thing, electronic motor registration, I think it was unanimous through the House and Senate. Everybody agreed that should be our job, recorder's job. And then the governor vetoed it. So I don't know exactly what it was. He put out a letter, but we'll run it again next year, see what happens.
All right, thanks again, David. I want to go through some of our viewers and listeners' questions here. And I guess, Will, this is a question for you. Will next year's next year's legislation affect the 2022 elections procedures as well?
If the question's a reference to the procedures manual, it won't be a procedures manual year next year. Obviously, they can always do an addendum to the manual based on circumstances, but certainly legislation that gets passed next session, depending on the general effective date. Obviously, we had a really long session this year. Depending on the effective date, could be in place for next year's election.
David, the new security features that you were just showing us, is that ballot then traceable to the voter? I guess the question would be, or the concern would be privacy concerns, that if somebody else got a hold of that ballot, then they're able to trace it to the home of the voter or the voter himself or herself.
Yeah, that question has come up, and no, because all the countermeasures are put on blank paper. Most, if not all, the counties order their paper at one time. So there's always a stock to be drawn from, because the manufacturer of this papers there's only one or two people and all states use them. So we order in advance. So you're going to have pallets of these blank ballots sitting in a warehouse. Then as election comes up, you pull off what you need, you print the ballot on. So there's no way of knowing which countermeasure, if it's a Maricopa ballot, a Cochise ballot, or Mojave ballot. It's just no way of knowing. And then you have to fold it and mail it out. So now there's another step of you don't know who's actually getting that ballot. So no, there's not a way of tracing that. I know the biggest thing was the barcode. And what the barcode provides is a way of you determining if it's a legitimate state ballot you received or not, because it comes up with the barcode number and the state seals, what they mocked up for us. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Probably not. But I've got pictures of what it can. Oh, wait. I've got my QR code. I was not picking it up. So.
No worries. I wanna go to Senator Quesada while you're trying to find it. There are a lot of questions about why the legislature is focused on bills that presumably would tackle, fraud in the elections. And one question from Mary says there are so many other pressing issues, and obviously she's disappointed with the legislature. Oh, there you go. So is that the barcode?
If you use a QR scanner on the ballot, which you see back, just the number and the state seal. That's it.
Got it. So I guess I want to pose that question to Martin. What do you make of all these election laws that purportedly, supposedly attempt to tackle fraud in the elections?
Well, these laws were all pushed to further a narrative this year. And that narrative ties back to the audit that's taking place by the Senate Republicans of our Maricopa County elections. And they wanted to find something wrong with this election system. And these bills were a furtherance of that narrative. Now, it's kind of a chicken or egg situation. Does the audit justify the bills, or do the bills justify the audit? And I think that they both kind of circle around each other. But ultimately, I think, especially in Maricopa County, we ran a fair, efficient, and an accurate election. And there were winners, both Democrats and Republicans. And we as the people should accept those. And I think that rather than accept those, we are furthering this audit, which is sad, and it's continuing to spiral downhill every single day. And I think that audit is now justifying a lot of these bills that are really just going to make things harder and more confusing. I think that's the key word that several speakers mentioned today. These are going to make things more confusing for your average everyday voter, not your voters like all of us who vote in every single election, who follow politics religiously, but your average voter, like my Nana, who doesn't follow politics every day, but she's going to get confused if she receives a notice from the county that says that she hasn't voted in the last couple of election cycles, and she's not going to know what to do. That type of confusion is going to become rampant, and I think it's going to suppress turnout.
And on that note, I think all of you mentioned the potential for voter confusion, and I think, Amy, you can probably answer, one question that I received earlier, which is that, this is really within the purview of the Citizens Clean Elections Commission, to try and educate voters. So I guess, is that an option if people are, for whatever reason, they're confused about what they need to do, they just call your office?
Definitely. And, I don't want to act like we're the only ones doing voter ed. I mean, the Secretary of State's office does their own voter education program. So do all the recorders and election directors. They all do a wonderful job. I think we get some synergy at our office because that's kind of one of our core missions. And the election offices are busy administering elections. But we also love to work with our local election officials and, cooperate in that way. But yeah, I think that's going to be key.
And Will, finally, there is an election law change that gives the Attorney General the sole authority to defend, election law challenges, effectively taking it away from your office. Your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unfortunate that the Attorney General went to the legislature and asked them to, remove powers from his own client. I think it's pretty clear over the past year or two that Secretary Hobbs and Attorney General Brnovich have very different ideas about election law and voter access and things like that. And so, it's kind of politics at its worst. It's the Republican Attorney General going to the Republican majority legislature and asking them to take power away from the state's highest elected Democratic official. I think it's really unfortunate. Voters don't like to see that kind of stuff, but to be clear, our office will still be defending voters when we can in court. We will be making sure our voice is heard, and we're just going to continue to get things done for voters in Arizona.
And I think we are out of time. I just want to thank again, Amy, David, Senator Quezada, Will. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. To our viewers and to our listeners, thank you again for spending 1 hour with us. I hope you learned something from today's morning scoop. And of course, there are two ways to kind of change the way things are run. The more difficult route is, of course, a protest. The easier route is by voting. So I would encourage everybody to just keep that in mind. You can change the way things by voting and actively participating in the electoral process. And with that, I want to thank again the Citizens Clean Elections Commission for sponsoring today's morning scoop and these series of discussions. And with that, thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.